your reflections, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you for the long introduction. And I'm sorry for moving this because I wanted to see the left half of the auditorium too while I'm talking. Yeah, so I hope it's okay. And also, thank you for the translators ahead of time because I think it's a difficult job. I could never do this. So please let me know if I speak too fast. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm speaking about something. So primarily, I'm a neuroscientist. I do a lot of philosophy in the background. So sort of putting things into socio-political angle is not my primary business. But you will see the way I do research and the way I conceive the brain-mind has major implications. And I will try to sort of walk you a little bit through some of the steps through my research. And at the end, I will show you the implication. And for me, it's very important that also almost the program of my neurophilosophy or the non-reductive approach I developed is that really different people talk with each other. And I mean really talking. So what is talking? Not just talking about the weather in Canada, it's too cold, it's snowing here, it's very nice and beautiful. But talking means really trying to understand the other's position, where she or he is coming from, the point of view. Dia and logos, yeah, talking through the different positions. That's the original meaning when Socrates went on the marketplace in Greece and confused the young people. That's a good thing, yeah, because you need to be confused. If you're not confused, it's a problem. So, and I will tell you, I think there is a deep, and I think the way our self works, the science of the self confirms such a view. And I will try to walk you through different steps. And Manuel pointed out, and at least for my research, and I think also for our time, one key question, very fundamental, is the relation for brain and mind. It's not just an academic question in philosophy or maybe in neuroscience, because this has huge implications, also for ethical questions. Every ethical opinion has an ontological, empirical, epistemological background assumptions. And we are notoriously weak in not articulating these background assumptions. Yeah. So it's very important because with the background assumptions, sometimes the foreground assumption change. Imagine if the floor of this building would be, of this room would be like this. Each of you would sit very different and try hard not to fall down. Yeah. Floor is the background, your chair is the foreground. So same here. And I think that's very important. So by the way, look this up. This is the Frankenstein movie, highly funny on YouTube, highly recommended. And some of that, what he tried in the movie, I think is somehow in part reality with the animal. So we can learn from the mistakes this poor guy did. So where I'm getting it. So there's a lot of discussion, Katinka touched upon this, about the upper. The upper part of the iceberg, you all know this picture. This is what is the conscious world, there's some unconsciousness. And then everybody says, okay, what is so special about the conscious? What is so special about this one? However, I said nothing. Why? Because this is based on this one. Any iceberg, I'm sure I've never been there, when you go to Patagonia, is it south? Yeah, it's south, because I always confuse south and north here. In Chile, because it's the opposite part of the world. In Canada, it's the other way around. So if you go, you know that every iceberg and the shape of this one is highly dependent upon what is beneath the water. And my claim is really that current neuroscience and philosophy of mind, I just put them all into one box, completely misses. Why is this so? Because this is where the iceberg is connected to its environment, the water. This is where the brain is connected to the world. Yeah, that's what I mean by world-brain relation, and not brain-world relation, which is up here. Yeah, so that's extremely important, and I will show you that the most inner psychological feature, our sense of self, which is always located in here, some homunculus, some special entity, and blah, 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 is down here. That's what the neuronal data show. And that has extremely important implications for any kind of business. Okay, so I already talked before I push the button. So how can we do this? Basically, if you want to go home now, you can go home. This is basically, I explicated a little bit in the rest of my talk. And that's it. So I will have three main foci, and I will walk you through them. My theoretical model of brain psyche, and you'll see everything will revolve around space and time. I will explicate that in the further course of my talk. Then I will provide you some flesh to the theoretical bones. I must say, the longer I'm working, the more I want the empirical stuff supporting the philosophical argument, topography and dynamic of the self. So that's really the key. And I show you some neuronal data which we acquired recently. And then, very important, which is often neglected in the self is intrinsically neuroecological and social. It's not just a secondary add-on. I have a special cognition. Some of you know against whom I argue here. Yeah, some special add-on or cognition, a little social. No, the bottom, the background, the floor on which we stand is intrinsically social and relational. Yeah, that will imply a different ontology, and I would argue also makes necessary different conceptions of ethics. I will come back to the end a very little bit to that. Okay, so let me start a little bit with the theoretical background. So what we're really suffering is how to link psyche, mind, brain, and we really have a gap. You already mentioned the heart problem, and that's basically, yeah, there's a gap of contingency, and of course that goes back to whom? René Descartes, who basically said, yes, the body can be viewed from the outside, the third-person perspective, and the mind cannot be perceived from the outside in third-person perspective, but only experienced in first-person perspective from the inside. So in a way, now the neuroscientists might kill me what I say. That dualism is still very much prevalent in our current neuroscience and philosophy of mind. I tell you why without going into conceptual detail. Because nowadays, the theories of consciousness say, yes, there is some special neuronal substrate for consciousness, distinguished from all the other neuronal substrates which remain unconscious. If that is not dualism, then what it is? It's a neuronal dualism. And that neuronal dualism, you see it almost in all theories of consciousness, maybe except the predictive coding approach, which has the potential to carry on. But in almost all other theories, yeah, and philosophy of mind, I don't need to tell you. That's clear. So there's a gap of contingency. What does this mean? We do not necessarily cannot link the neuronal to the mental activity. There's nothing which connects the two. Yeah? You and I are connected through the language and also through the translators. Yeah? So they translate my English into Spanish so that you can understand and that we can interact. Now imagine if I were to start speaking German. Now maybe some of you have a German background, you never know here in Chile. We could not communicate. We wouldn't share anything. There would be a gap between us, a gap of contingency. The English necessarily connects. You have no choice but listening to it. But we're speaking German, we would say this. Okay, I got it. Yeah, and that's the kind of gap. So what we are looking, philosophically speaking, is for a necessary connection between the brain and the mental. And for the specialists in that field, it's not a necessary a priori connection I'm looking for, because I'm not a philosopher. I'm looking for a necessary a posteriori connection. That's why I'm a neurophilosopher, yeah, and not just a philosopher. Sorry. Good. So, and what do we find then? So what I developed also here together with Katinka in the paper, which is fortunately a lot of has been picked up a lot now. We look for something which are shared by brain and mind. Where can you find that? and very basic features of the natural world. Yeah? Look at this beautiful quote by Tesla. Again, look up his website. He's as interesting and crazy as the guy, Elon Musk, who does the Tesla car, so there's a connection there. If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. So what I'm doing here, I'm not referring to some special features which are just in the human brain. No, I'm going the opposite way. I look for the most basic, fundamental, non-special features in the natural world and say that these features are key for developing mental features. Because after all, mental features are natural features. So don't come now with the argument or not of the panpsychism. I will trash that argument discussion. Yeah. So that's the basic idea. And everything revolves around that. And what do I mean by time and space? Basic. Go to the seaside, it's not far from here, you know it. You see big waves, you see small waves. The big waves are very powerful, very slow, and have a lot of energy. So it's good for surfing, they propel you a lot. The small waves are short, fast, and not very powerful. Same in the brain. You have different waves, meaning continuous activity change. Continuous activity. Keep that in mind, very important. Continuous different, this is basically raw data, and there's a certain pattern, and this is the kind of pattern with slower waves, faster waves, which you can measure with fMRI, EEG, I spare you the details. And these kind of features, I say, they're permanently constructed in the brain, and you can also see them, they provide the connection to the mental features. And my talk is showing that. And we developed a lot of, for measuring these kind of dynamic patterns. That's where you go into engineering. Engineering and physics, so I work a lot with those guys in recent years. Because they have measures, they can operationalize these kind of dynamic changes, the pattern. Yeah? So that's basically the same thing. So it's a dynamic, just for a conceptual rehearsal. What do I mean by dynamic? Dynamic is the change from one time point to another. Yeah? So there's a certain pattern of change. For instance, now I change my voice, not at all, there is no time, and now I change it. I'll not change it a lot. Different dynamic in my voice. Yeah, very important. And if some of you are interested in brain imaging, I can show you the important. And then topography, what do I mean by topography? Topography is a concept which comes from geography. And you see these lines, you see the hills, you see the mountains, basically the geographic maps. And that's the same. The brain has, among its different regions and networks, there's a certain spatial organization of the whole brain. So now that's basically the theoretical background, and now I want to provide you some flesh to the bones and look for the self. What do I mean by self? Self is often in current cognitive neuroscience considered like a separate cognitive functions, like this bottle. There's another bottle called attention, yet another bottle called working memory, and this bottle is, I don't know, sustained attention, and so forth. However, when I started this research on self, I think it's now 20 years ago, no, I don't want to know so long. For me, it's always an expression of the basic subjectivity of human nature. Yeah? Of course, the cognitive neuroscientists reading my paper don't see that. Yeah? So I'm after where does this basic subjectivity of our experience come from? That's for me the self. And here I indicate a preview of a little bit I talk tomorrow, that this kind of self, this basic subjectivity, is altered in psychiatric disorders. Very important. With a basic subjectivity change. So this is what I'm after. So here I show you a little bit some recent data. So here we show it's a topography of the brain. And what we see, this is a meta-analysis of all kinds of self-studies in recent cognitive science. And it shows that the self is not a unitary homogeneous construct, but it has different layers. Yeah, it has an interoceptive layer about your inner body, your heart, your breathing, your stomach, part of yourself. And that's very, very clinically, from a psychiatric perspective, that's extremely intuitive, because many of patients, for instance, with trauma or dissociation, have strong interoceptive symptoms. Yeah, abnormal heart beating, respiration problems, stomach problem, all unspecific because the medical people don't find anything. Then you have more exoceptive, proprioceptive processing. This is for the level of the studies by Olaf Blanke et al. And you see, again, slightly different regions. So this involves the first one, interoceptive bilateral insular, thalamus, here dorsal anterior cingulate, so typical science network region. Exoceptive is here the bilateral TPJ, temporal parietal junction, insula again. And then you have sort of the more cognitive, the mental, where you're detached from your own interactions, you dwell in your own thoughts, you project yourself into the future, mental time travel. And there you see the typical cortical midline structures, the default mode, network region. And what is really interesting, let me see, what is really interesting in the whole thing, and you can already see this here, that the regions from the interoceptive are replicated in the exoceptive. They're also, the insula is also activated here and also in the mental. Yeah, so this is a very interesting thing. This is like nestedness. Yeah, so the lower order regions, the interoceptive, are again recruited during the next layer, the exoceptive. Yeah, this is what we try to indicate here. And this is really like the Russian dots. Or here the Chinese, of course, has a more refined version, the Chinese crystal ball. These are all the same crystal balls, different sizes. Unbelievable. I don't know how they did this. Yeah, incredible. Yeah, so you see this kind of, my Chinese student made me aware of when I gave the talk in China that I show this one. So, and this is amazing. Yeah, so, and this is exactly the same. You have sort of different topographies, and then they constantly extend in more region. And that provides an overall organization. Nestedness. The key feature of nature in general, you see nested organizations. Let's say when you look at trees, the layer of trees, when you cut the trunk on quandaries, you see a nested organization. So the most basic feature of nature, nothing special. Yeah. And interestingly, we see this kind of topography already in the resting state, when you don't process any self-specific stimuli. So it's an intrinsic feature of your brain. Your brain has this organization. It's a basic, I would say, a basic subjectivity inherent in the topography of your brain. And I will not, probably not show this, but in different psychiatric disorders, the relation between these different layers or Russian dolls are changed. One is too big, the other one is too small, and that gives some discrepancy in our mental life. Yeah. So this is very interesting. So my hope is that this can also serve for differential diagnostic in psychiatric disorders. And we're working on that. So this is the same thing. This is actually done by Andrea Scalabrini, the co-author on this paper, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst and a neuroscientist. A brilliant guy. He's now in Bergamo professor. And as a Jungian, he's very Eastern inspired. He draws everything in circles. Very interesting. You see this. Yeah, when you give the same task to a typical Western Anglo-American person, they would draw different boxes. The Eastern people, and Jung was strongly impacted by the Eastern, always in circles. And I think this one is right. Yeah. Okay. So same thing here. So I showed you a little bit about the topography of the self. It's a nested organization, and you will see why that is very relevant later. So it's not just one single region, one single function. It's a nested organization, and it's intrinsic. Your brain has a predisposition to develop that. Yeah, and what we're also trying now to do to look for this topography also in other species. Maybe when we just investigate the topography on the neural level, we can infer something for the mental, and that's exactly what you want. Yeah. So now I show you a little bit about the dynamic. Remember, I showed you the wave stuff here, and you see, have the slow waves are very powerful, as you all know when you're surfing. They have a lot of power, and you have faster waves. They're harmless. You're not afraid of the faster waves. but you're afraid of the big waves that might smash you towards the beach. Now, what we did here, again, pure resting state, no specific task, nothing cognitive here, just subjects don't do anything, just lie in the scanner, enjoy their life, or not. So in what you can measure, basically, the balance between faster power here and slower power. Yeah, the power is higher in the slower frequencies than in the faster. This is called scale-free activity. Yeah, you have more power in the slower, less power in the faster, as I illustrated already several times. And you see there's a certain steepness of the curve, which you can measure using the power law exponent. And you can see here again these midline structures, and we see each curve is one subject. So you see how different the subjects are. Yeah, I think, I don't know, 40 people are here in the room. I'm sure we have all different, what we call power spectra. Yeah, we're all different. Yeah, particularly you compared to me, because we're in different cultural contexts. Yeah, and huge impact. So, and then you also see the different regions are also not the same. This looks slightly different than here. So each region, you can imagine in the brain, contributes something slightly different. So imagine the brain, that's the way I often imagine the brain, like here this whole room with all people would be one brain, and each contributes slightly different. So I'm always amazed how well usually our brain is coordinated. Yeah. So that's quite amazing. And then we looked for these, the steepness of the curves, how that is related to self-consciousness. We applied a scale for that, your sense of self-consciousness, and there are different scores, private, public, social. Particularly here, go for the private. So you see quite a good, highly significant correlation that you see the more power you have in the slower frequencies, yeah, the longer time scales you have, the higher your sense of self, the higher your degree of self-consciousness. Yeah, so that means it's important, and that provides you with temporal continuity. Longer waves provide you with more temporal continuity, and that's what you're self about. Again, you see, let me just go back, you see yourself, it's like the nestedness across all frequencies. It's not just one single frequency, it's a relationship between the balance between all frequencies. So it's nested. The more nested it is, the better. So, same here, like the surfer, the self prefers the big, powerful waves. So, that gave you a little bit an idea about space, topography, time, dynamic of the self, and we have a lot of studies where we now also investigate the same kind of measures on the psychological. Yeah, so you can see that the higher your slower frequencies in the brain, the better you can overcome temporal delays on the psychological level. Yeah? So you see the temporal continuity on both neuronal and psychological level. Yeah? That's the common occurrence. Now, but I don't go into that because I want to show you an aspect which is fundamentally important for philosophy and neuroscience. The problem is that in current neuroscience, the philosophical implications are made from this one without considering this one. And this is purely empirical. This has no direct ontological implications. This one has, because this is the interface of the self with the world. That's where ontological and ethical implications come. Yeah, very important. When you start from here, you end up with a reductive approach. You just reduce the ontological concepts to the ethical, to the empirical concepts. That's the kind of reductive neurophilosophy which is very prevalent, and also reductive neuroethics. As I see it, very prevalent in the Anglo-American world. I think if you really want to go into neurophilosophy and neuroethical issues, you need to consider this dimension, the neuroecological dimension. And that reveals fascinating stuff. And I show you a little bit of the data, because this is the real interface between neuroscience and philosophy. And it's not explicated these days, because they have this view that the mental is here inside the brain. The most stupidest thing in 50 years, I hope, that our successors will look back. How stupid. Yeah? And I often like to say, when a brain would sit there and say, that I'm not interested in what you guys are talking. It's not about me. Yeah? Because the brain constantly tries to keep in coordination. So here I show you one study which a postdoc from Scotland did at the time. So here he investigated young adults, these were mostly college students, and again, pure resting state in the brain. And they also got a childhood traumatic questionnaire, CTQ, and they can basically, for early childhood event like emotional neglect, physical neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. I will come back to that. And then he said, okay, I want to look how the early traumatic childhood traumata affect the dynamic structure of the brain. So here he investigated entropy. Entropy is about disorder. So let's say now you are in a state of low entropy because apparently everybody is listening to me. Could also be the, I don't want to know the truth. Yeah. So, but let's say now if everybody was just talking by himself, by her or himself, and this one in a different language, then you would have a state of high entropy. That's basically the state your brain is in when you have a lot of early traumatic childhood trauma experience. Yeah, it's disorder. There's no temporal coordination, no synchronization. Everybody does what he or she wants. Same here in the brain. Yeah. So over time there is no, and that's very important, no temporal continuity. Yeah, because your sense of self is about temporal continuity in your own mental life and in your relationship to the environment. We try to establish temporal continuity between us, and that gives us temporal, for instance, by synchronizing. Classical example, when we hear music, we completely unconscious, no voluntary, we just do this, we like the music and we do this. Yeah, and here in Chile, actually, I do it a lot because I hear a lot of music from the 70s, 80s when I grew up, a lot of the hits I like. So it's wonderful. So I often do this completely unconscious. I synchronize with the music, and that, so I extend myself beyond my outer body boundaries to the external environment, and that makes me feel great. Yeah, that's a synchronization. And we investigate that now a lot, because also in mental disorders, this synchronization is disrupted. Yeah? So this is key, and that tells you mental features are not in here. Mental features are between you and me. It's a relations. So I think these kind of findings lend support to this. So here's another finding. This is actually from depression. This is a study which we conducted in China, and I'm a big fan of the Eastern culture, as you already heard, and I learn a lot also from their philosophy. Here you see that here we investigated time, so we investigated time perception. This was a purely psychological study, and we used the Zimbardo time inventory for this, perspective inventory for this, which has different dimensions, future, past, negative past, positive past. And we also again did the childhood traumatic questionnaire with these different dimensions: emotional abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, and physical abuse. And we investigated the time perspective, as I said, with the Zimbardo, and we investigated the depression severity with BDI scale. So this was a large sample, over 100 subjects, and healthy subjects. So now we were interested in how are these different features related to each other. Because, as you know, oh my gosh, you're really strict with me. So give me a couple of more minutes. You asked me to speak slow. So that's the minutes. She did it non-verbally, yeah? She indicated it. So, sorry, I beg for another minute. So what we did, and this is very interesting here. So we had two different models, because the cognitive people would argue time perception anomalies are a consequence of the depressive symptoms. Your depression alters your cognition, and that changes your time perception. However, in my model, the spatial temporal model, I would say, no. The spatial temporal features are key for your depressive feature. So then you can test that with what we call a mediation model. You can say, okay, childhood trauma is clear, is here. The dependent variable is either the time perspective mediated by the depression symptoms, that would be the cognitive model, or you say the depressive symptoms are a consequence of abnormal time perception. That's the spatial temporal model. And to my delight at the time, this model was highly significant, this one not. I spare you the details of the statistics here. So meaning, if you have a childhood, an event, emotionally neglected by your mother, then whether that becomes a traumatic event depends upon your time perception. If your time perception is relatively positive, future-oriented, that event will not turn into a traumatic event. However, if your time perspective is already before the event very negative, you have a higher likelihood that that event becomes a traumatic event. So what I want to say, your own brain, your psyche, has a strong impact on whether this event becomes a traumatic event or not. Because as a clinical psychiatrist, I see patients, the same event can have completely different consequences. It's amazing. That's a basic subjectivity. Remember, that was my starting point. And that is spatial temporal. So for me, these findings are fascinating. I keep this short. This is a knife, so since I was urged to keep myself short, I forget that. So this becomes a little bit more into the philosophy. So what does this basic subjectivity mean? Subjectivity in the Western world, Thomas Nagel is often said, okay, there's a point of view. Yeah, Thomas Nagel, 1974, what is it like to be bad? It's a point of view. And in the Western philosophy, this point of view is always equated with the first-person perspective. That's a fundamental flaw. When you read the 1974 paper by Nagel, there is not one mention of first-person perspective. Yeah? Because the point of view is more fundamental. It's prior to the distinction between first and third-person perspective. Yeah? So I don't go into these quotes because of time constraints, but what I want to say, the point of view had a mental layer. Yes, it's a mental surface layer. That's your first-person perspective. Yeah, that's true. However, the point of view has a much deeper layer, a neuroecological background layer. Yeah, that's where it's not yet a distinction between first and third-person perspective. Yeah, that's where you're embedded within the world and integrated, yeah, thrown into the world, as Heidegger likes to say, being in the world. Sartre has a beautiful description of that, the phenomenological tradition. And this is not just body as Merleau-Ponty said. This is a virtual point of view created by your time-space relationship of your brain to the time-space of the environment. And I cannot show you more data on that. So this is really key. And you also see here the dimensions. You see here is the ontological level, because the ontological only starts when we talk about the world, or how the brain is embedded within the world. Yeah? Otherwise, for me, it's a misnomer, it's empirical. Yeah? So the confusion of these different dimensions is blatant in the current philosophy, yeah, and in neuroscience too. So for me, this is very, very important to make it very clear. So that's why we try here, and I don't go into the details here. By the way, this is a paper which we just published finally after 5 years. I told Katinka, and she said, it's unpublishable. She was right, but I was stubborn. German stubbornness is not to be underestimated. So this is another quote. And what is important, remember I showed you the topography of the cell. It's an intrinsic feature of your brain. It's a necessary part of the brain that you have this kind of three-layer topography of it. Now I go even further. It's a necessary feature of the brain that it shares temporal similarities with the environmental context. Yeah, the time scales of your brain and your environmental context must be somehow overlapping. When Jean-Pierre, in his earlier talk, made these different species and the huge enlargement of the brain, my hypothesis would be the enlargement of the brain goes together with an enlargement of the time scales, and that makes it possible that you temporally much more overlap with your environment, and that you're in a way better embedded and also can better manipulate them. Yeah, so for me, this is ultimately a temple process. And they speak here very nicely, this is a conceptual philosophical of temple point of view. Yeah, this temple point, this view here, this neuroecological background point of view, that in their case, it's not conceptual, it's temporal. And I would say this is sort of a pre-phenomenal experience. It's not even pre-reflective, as the phenomenology people say, but it's pre-phenomenal. You barely sense it. Yeah, you have no access to it, but it's always there. It's against your background. Yeah, without the background, you wouldn't perceive the foreground. So this is the same thing here. Try to link this, and this is basically the link between, remember, the scale-free activity dynamic and the world. This is exactly this, and your point of view conceptually mediates the two. And so that's basically your direct connection is always there. So I speak of a world-brain relation. And this is one point I want to make, which is important because we often confuse it. I speak explicitly from world-brain and not from brain-world. Because if you speak from brain-world, you always have the feeling, okay, there's a brain, and somehow you link to the world. No, 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 that's empirical. Ontologically, your brain is part of the world. And your world shapes your brain. That's what we see in early development in the infant, when the mother is not properly holding the kid, or you will show disastrous consequences when they're hungry. Yeah, so that's a world-brain relation. Our brain is deeply shaped by the environmental context. Yeah, we don't have this omnipotence that we can shape the world. Yeah, that's really a pre-Copernican belief. So that's a basic, that shapes your point of view, and then you go there. So that presupposes ultimately for me a relational ontology, and also when you go a pre-normative, a pre-conceptual ethics. What do I mean by that? It's pre-normative doesn't mean that it is non-normative. Means there's a predisposition for developing normativity. Yeah, and from my point of view, but it's extremely tentative, I would say that this pre-normativity must be explicated in spatial-temporal terms. So the stark opposition between descriptive and normative is not yet present here, but it's differentiated there. Yeah, that's the ground. It's a very transcendental-like argumentation there. Obviously, I'm German, I come from Kant. So that's basically where the difference between normative and descriptive is constituted. So that means there's a pre-normative, a pre-descriptive level, and that means there is never pure normativity or pure descriptive. There is no pure empirical, pure ethical research. And we all know this, they're necessarily interconnected. We just must bring out these necessary interconnections. Yeah, and I think that's extremely, okay, sorry, I didn't even know that I had the slide. You see here, it's another iceberg, you know my preference. It is this deeper level. That's where we need to make the interfaces. And that interface between world and brain, that's where the distinction between normative and descriptive issues, conceptual, non-conceptual, is constituted. So we really need to go back to the basics, to the origin, the generative origins, if you want to say. And neuroscience can help you getting there, but neuroscience cannot provide the answer, because that would mean to confuse empirical and ontological domains, and ultimately then also empirical and ethical domains. Yeah? So very important, and I know I overextended my 4 minutes, but now I'm at the end. Thank you very much.
I invite you to join the panel now, and we have some attendees here. We will be part of the panel. El próximo panel se llama Cerebro, Identidad Humana y Responsabilidad Moral, que de alguna manera toca aspectos que han sido propuestos por el doctor Northrop, pero van más allá de él también. Y para ello invitamos a Andrea Hidalgo, que es coordinadora del Centro de Ética Aplicada de la Facultad de Filosofía, CEDEA, quien va a moderar este panel. la doctora Valentina Bulo, que es filósofa académica del Instituto de Estudio Avanzado IDEA de la Universidad de Santiago de Chile. Muchas gracias, que trabaja materialidades y hay diferentes aspectos que van a escucharle en su intervención. El doctor Rodrigo Salinas, que es médico clínico, Servicio de Neurología, Hospital Salvador. Bienvenido, doctor, del Departamento de Ciencia Neurológica Oriente de la Facultad de Medicina, integrante del Comité de Ética del Colegio Médico. Y el doctor Raúl Villarroel, un gusto tenerlo con nosotros, del Departamento de Filosofía, del Centro de Ética Aplicada y decano de la Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades.
Hola, ¿se escucha? Muy buenas tardes a todos, todas y todes. En nombre del CEDEA quiero expresar nuestro agradecimiento y alegría por poder haber sido parte de esta iniciativa, no solo este congreso, sino también el lanzamiento de la iniciativa de neuroética de la Universidad de Chile, que además coincide con nuestro aniversario, 180 años ya. No son tantos para la perspectiva europea, pero para nosotros que somos, comillas, un nuevo continente, significa bastante, ¿no? La Universidad de Chile en realidad tiene más años, lo que pasa es que inicialmente era una universidad confesional de cuanto a los profesores visitantes, entonces no contamos ese pasado. Bueno, agradezco también a quienes nos acompañan. Está aquí conmigo, voy a leer. Bueno, en realidad los conozco a casi todos. La profesora Valentina Bulo, ¿cómo está, profesora? No sé si te acuerdas de mí. Filósofa, académica responsable de la colección del Instituto de Estudios Avanzados, IDEA, de la Universidad de Santiago de Chile. Bienvenida. El doctor Rodrigo Salinas, médico clínico, Servicio de Neurología, Hospital El Salvador, académico del Departamento de Ciencias Neurológicas Oriente de la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Chile, integrante del Comité de Ética del Colegio Médico y miembro de la Comisión de Priorización de la Ley Ricarte-Soto. Bienvenido, profesor. Y finalmente el doctor Raúl Villarroel, del Departamento de Filosofía de la Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades de la Universidad de Chile, miembro del Centro de Estudios de Ética Aplicada, CEDEA, y decano de la misma Facultad de Filosofía y Humanidades de la Universidad de Chile. Profe, ¿cómo estás? Y está aquí conmigo el profesor Northoff. Hello, good afternoon, how are you? Thank you so much for the great conference you just gave us. Did you understand everything I said? Wonderful. Ah, perfecto, no olvidaste la... Sí, enormes gracias. Voy a dar la palabra entonces a cada uno de los panelistas para que puedan comentar, conversar, quizás hacer alguna pregunta. Déjame contarte que quedé fascinada con el tema de la perspectiva temporal y la influencia que ello puede tener en la depresión o en otras patologías psiquiátricas, ¿no? Hablaste que la perspectiva de futuro en el fondo era la que podía determinar que se desarrollasen o no síntomas depresivos, ¿no? Bueno, yo trabajo las pasiones desde la perspectiva semiótica y la definición que diste es una de las bases de la definición de la esperanza. Me pareció maravilloso. Ah, okay.
So there is sometimes it's used that no, I can't hear the Spanish parallel. It's too much. I cannot speak that. It tells you already how we work, yeah, how the brain works. Yeah, you mentioned the language. There's a lot of discussion now that we use artificial intelligence for recognizing depressed patients with suicidal words. And this is in part successful. However, we have a different approach to that, and this is really fascinating. That's why I'm fascinated by myself by that. So that we're using the temporal envelopes of language. So meaning we use the semantic. We have a semantic. Vupama is the semantic program which comes from Google, and there's also SBIRD, also from Google. And then we look for the fluctuations in these semantic values. Yeah, and what we see, if you have slower fluctuations in your speech, in the SBIRD and in the Vupama stuff, you're more abstract. Yeah, if you have faster fluctuations, you're more concrete. Yeah, that's basically in a nutshell. So, and why is that so? So the assumption from my point of course, we do this now on the psychological level, obviously I want to link it to the brain. There. And that's why I'm saying that. The idea is if you have longer waves, longer fluctuations, you can integrate more words, meaning you become more abstract. Yeah? If you have faster fluctuations, you have shorter waves, you cannot integrate as many words, so you have to be more concrete. Yeah? That's sort of the working hypothesis, which we want to do. So meaning that, and I think I will show this picture tomorrow, that even your cognitive functions, not only like self or like semantics, of course semantics is a delicate case for a philosopher, has this temporal envelope. Yeah, so there's a temporal structuring of your language. Yeah, that doesn't invalidate the language, but gives you a mechanism which could link it to the brain stuff. That's sort of.
Gracias, profesor. Ahora sí vamos a darle la palabra a nuestros invitados. No sé si les parece que vaya al profesor Villarroel. Profe, bienvenido.
Gracias. Muy buenos días. Buenos días, profesor Northoff. Bueno, en primer lugar quisiera felicitarle, ¿no? Porque me parece que es de la más pertinente, digo, actualidad, el contenido de la presentación. Y bueno, si he podido entender, ¿no es cierto?, el contenido final de la propuesta, me parece muy interesante el desafío que queda planteado a partir, digamos, de lo señalado, en la medida en que, si entiendo bien, de lo que se trata es de sortear, ¿no es cierto?, ese gap of contingency, ¿no? Esa suerte de escollo insuperable, ¿no es cierto?, que ha representado para la filosofía el dualismo cartesiano. Y que en cierto modo parece que pesa, ¿no es cierto?, hasta el día de hoy como un lastre insuperable para la neurociencia más convencional, y que en cierto modo representa, ¿no es cierto?, el punto de interés de la propuesta del profesor Northoff. Y yo celebro que, digamos, lo que entiendo, ¿no?, es que en definitiva la posibilidad de avanzar por sobre ese escollo, de sortear esa dificultad epistemológica prácticamente insuperable, no está planteada al modo de una simple solución de continuidad, que podría ser en cierto modo el recurso más usual al cual se pudiera echar mano para poder resolver el asunto con cierta simpleza y facilidad. Me parece que esta integración, ¿no es cierto?, esta ontología relacional de la cual da cuenta, ¿cierto?, la perspectiva del profesor Northoff, es en realidad un punto de superación, de avance por sobre esa particular solución de continuidad que a menudo, ¿no es cierto?, se aprecia en las propuestas de la neurociencia contemporánea. Me parece notable en ese sentido. Quisiera plantearle una suerte de emplazamiento al profesor Northoff, ¿no?, para iniciar un diálogo, y que dice relación con la posibilidad de pensar hasta qué punto pudiera haber, ¿no es cierto?, una instancia de vinculación, de conexión, de sintonía con otras propuestas en las cuales se aprecian, ¿no es cierto?, constructos teóricos relativamente semejantes y que refieren fundamentalmente, ¿no es cierto?, a la escena reflexiva del posthumanismo. Elaboraciones como las de Braidotti, por ejemplo, ¿no es cierto?, Haraway o Timothy Morton, me parece que podrían tener algún vínculo, algún punto de conexión con la elaboración que nos ha presentado el profesor Northoff. Me gustaría saber si existe, digamos, alguna vinculación, ¿no es cierto?, con esas recientes elaboraciones de la reflexión filosófica contemporánea que aluden precisamente, ¿no es cierto?, a la construcción del yo, en nuevas escenas de la reflexión. E incluso considerar si podría haber, ¿no es cierto?, peregrinamente alguna vinculación con una elaboración un poco anterior, como por ejemplo la idea de una ecología social, de una ecología mental, como la que propuso alguna vez, ¿no es cierto?, Guattari hace bastantes años atrás. Eso creo para iniciar la conversación y después seguimos.
Do you want to answer right now, or you're going to take?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. It was a nice comment, and you had a very nice formulation. And that's indeed, I think, what I do. Sorry, I have to put you away. Gaps of contingency in current philosophy. It's a very nice description. I could not have formulated my way myself. That's really nicely put. And when I mean here philosophy, that's why I invented this idea of non-reductive neurophilosophy to address philosophical issues. However, what do I mean by philosophy? And I wasn't aware when I started this some years ago, but I think now I'm better. So, and I want to make the distinction here between metaphysics and ontology. I know that usually ontology is considered part of metaphysics. From a philosophical perspective, that's perfectly fine. The natural world is part of the broader logical. Bingo, clear, easy. However, so that means you look for the similarities between the natural and logical. Fair. And that's what philosophy of mind currently does. That's basically the ticket on which philosophy of mind makes philosophical assumption between the brain-mind, based on looking for on the presupposition of similarities between the natural and logical world. However, I say that doesn't work. Because there's another viewpoint. Why is it even possible to distinguish the natural world as subset of the logical world? That's never asked in philosophy. Yeah? And I'm asking that. I'm asking that as somebody who's primarily interested in the natural world, and then I'm asking, what makes it different from the logical world? And that's for me the borderline between ontology and metaphysics. Yeah? So, and that's also for me the borderline between philosophy and what I mean by non-reductive neurophilosophy. Very, very important. So when I'm thinking, now you can say, not of your time stuff, goodbye, go home, go back even to Germany, not even back to Canada, forget it. You're right. From a metaphysical perspective, you're absolutely right. And I say, my concept, what I presented today, is not a philosophical, it's a neurophilosophical statement. Very important. It's an ontological, it's not a metaphysical statement. So, and that has important implications. Yes, I want to close the gaps of contingency. I'm all with you, beautiful formulations, but, and we want to both, we share, let's say I put you into the corner of philosophers now, we both want to glue it in a necessary way. That's a similarity. But you will do it a priori, based on conceptual reasoning. And that conceptual reasoning is by default, aspatial and atemporal. It's not even non-temporal and non-spatial. It's atemporal. Yeah, not even the possibility of time and space is given, because that would undermine the logic. Yeah, so now, and that's where I say, I want to do it necessary a posteriori, because that brings in the possibility of the empirical investigation of the ontological in terms of time and space. So my concepts, which I use, are intrinsically spatial temporal, and that I support by empirical claims. Yeah, so I do not, and that's very important, and then I close my answer. Very important, I do not infer from the empirical to the ontological. That would be an empirical ontological fallacy. Kant already accused Hume of that. He called it empirical physiological, can't remember reason. Yeah. Last point, to the postmodernism. So I don't know these authors, I must admit, you mentioned, but I studied a lot of all the postmodern philosophy, Derrida, Levinas, Foucault, back and forth. I did all that. And I liked it and I don't like it. So I liked it because I think they clean the room. Yeah, they deconstruct. That's the way I understood the deconstruction. They clean the room and say, okay, the traditional philosophical concepts like entity-based ontology, blah, 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 Foucault, for this, don't work. And I agree with them. However, they do not build the new room. They just leave it by that. And that's where I don't like it. And I think that's where my space-time set kicks in. Yeah. So I understood the deconstructivism. The decomponent, yes. The constructive cause is not in there. Social ecology, I think it's a field which I don't know well. I had some encounters with ecological psychology, and recently Riedwald and, of course, what is the other guy? from Netherlands, who's now in Australia, I can't remember. They have very interesting work in that direction, ecological psychology, which is probably not that far from social ecology. Yeah, and I remember that one professor in Taiwan from the Academia Sinica, he says, "Oh, not of you doing an ecological ontology," and I think he's right.
Muchas gracias, profesor. ¿Profesor va a retrucar o va...?
No, no.
Quedo contento. ¿A quién le damos el...? Ya, la profesora Bulo.
Bien, muchas gracias. Gracias por la invitación. Yo trabajo filosofía desde las ontologías relacionales, así es que al principio pensé que no tenía mucho que ver con este congreso. También leyendo los textos de él empecé a darme cuenta que sí, así que muchas gracias por la presentación. Y tenía una pregunta, dos preguntas para empezar, porque tengo varias, pero una inquietud que yo creo que fue respondida a Raúl, que tenía que ver con una cuestión más bien epistemológica, porque, y era, a lo mejor lo puedes precisar un poco más, preguntarte con lo que haces en términos interdisciplinarios, porque justamente, más que hacer, citaste a Kant por ahí, más que hacer calzar la intuición con el concepto y forzar al concepto para que entre en la intuición, hay una ampliación de lo que se trabaja, de lo que se entiende también como empírico. Entonces, no es cómo el concepto determina, cómo el concepto se ajusta al campo empírico, sino más bien una co-construcción. Entonces, preguntarte un poco más ahí en el sentido de cómo se está haciendo en términos epistemológicos. Y lo otro, quizás provocando, voy a arrojar una tesis, a ver si puede ser o no. Y podría afirmarse que el trabajo tuyo es un trabajo de un cerebro no antropocéntrico, en el sentido de, suena contradictorio, es como un círculo cuadrado, por eso es una provocación. Pero si nosotros tomamos una ontología relacional, justamente aunque se esté trabajando uno de los elementos de la relación, lo primario no es el elemento, sino la relación que está determinando a cada uno de los relacionados. Y en este sentido, lo que se está entendiendo como este fondo social y ecológico no es entendido como un medio, sino justamente como parte de una red de relaciones y un campo de frecuencias, justamente, en donde el acento está más que en lo propiamente humano, justamente en aquellos que materialmente compartimos entre nosotros. Entonces ahí quizás podríamos nosotros hablar más que de una primera persona singular, de un yo, hablar de un nosotros, de una primera persona plural, entendiendo en ese nosotros también no solo los humanos, sino justamente todo aquello que nos rodea y en lo cual estamos teniendo frecuencias, digamos, con aquello con lo que estamos teniendo frecuencia. Ayer en una clase, una alumna expuso sobre el canto de los pájaros y el modo de habitar de los pájaros. Y la tesis de ella, con los libros que ella trabajaba, era que el canto era el cuerpo, pero que el canto era la manera de hacer un territorio a través de un ritmo. Entonces, ahí termino de preguntar en el sentido de cómo tú estás entendiendo el tiempo, porque lo estás entendiendo en términos cómo se entiende o qué concepto de tiempo se está trabajando y si tiene alguna relación con un ritmo, o entendiendo el tiempo como como una caja espacio-temporal en la cual estamos nosotros dentro, que parece que no es así.
Yeah, very good question. A lot of questions. So, okay, I try to keep myself short. So, first you started with the concept of epistemology. So, of course, first, classical and too much of a Kantian, what can we know? How can we know it? Yeah, so the how is very important for me because I'm an empirical person, I'm looking for mechanisms. Yeah, and I don't speak here of pure empirical, of neuroepistemological mechanisms. Yeah. Then the other thing, it was sort of indicated that I would not make an all or nothing. This is ontology, this is epistemology, this is empirical. I would put a gradient on it. Yeah, this is very unusual for a traditional philosopher because you require your concepts, require the way your concepts are defined and determined by default, all or nothing. Yeah. Which on a conceptual logical level is fine. Probably you can undermine, I see your face, you can argue against it, maybe. But I think in the empirical, I don't think in those terms. I think in terms of continuum and gradients. And I think one can make it. I can say it's a predominantly ontological statement. It carries certain epistemological implications and so forth. That was the gradient which I indicated. So I think that's where, and that I think that's a neurophilosophical rather than purely philosophical approach, yeah? Because it's not just conceptually driven. That's very important. Methodology, 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 and I think it's really underestimated in current philosophy. Neuroscience, you can criticize neuroscience a lot, and I agree with most of that, but sometimes they have a quite good methodological awareness, what the scanner does, what the EEG does, the kind of artifact. And I think this is lacking a little bit in philosophy. You spoke another topic, the non-anthropocentric. So now I need to ask you, did you read my book? Because you know that I'm for a Copernican revolution. It's a long topic. I just want to give you one example because you linked it sort of to the timescales as I understood, and the relational ontology. So for me, what Copernicus did, he drew a temporal relationship between the movement and the Earth, the movement, the Earth movements and the universe. And by that he said, okay, it cannot be that the universe, the Earth is center. So it wouldn't explain temporal movement, the time dimension, the change. That can only be part of the life. So then it's basically, it's not that the Earth harbored, embedded the universe, the other way around. And that's, for me, a primarily temporal relationship. Now, what did Darwin do? He did the same thing. He put things into temporal perspective. Yeah? He looked for the temporal evolution of these different species, inferred that in a brilliant way from his empirical observation. But as we know from Tinker, he was not always brilliant. And yeah, and basically by then was able to put the humans in the wider context of the biological. So for me, these Copernican revolutions, they're often considered, oh, it's something negative, we lost our innocence, we lost our center. I say, no, it's the opposite. Come on, you are integrated in a larger whole. Yeah, I mean, this is fantastic. And this is for me, and this is the same what I'm trying to do when I speak of a world-brain relation. Now for the time scale. That's why I wanted to ask Jean-Pierre about the time scale. Because I expect that to look for ultrasonic waves. Our brain cannot process ultrasonic waves. What is it like to be a bird, Thomas? Our brain cannot process seismic earth waves. That's why we are so bad in predicting earthquakes. Yeah, we just have not the frequencies, not the time scales in our brain. However, we have a certain overlap in the time scales here and in the time scales in the environment. And maybe our overlap between the world's time scales and the brain's time scales are larger than for other species. Yeah? Whether it's better or not, there's no value judgment. Yeah? That's maybe the increase in the brain size, what Jean-Pierre demonstrated, specific features. Yeah? So, and now we might even be, remember we had this one discussion in Paris with the Heidelberg guy from the HPP, when we built that our environment changes, the timescales of our environment changes, and then we need to build different artificial agents. Yeah? Or we may even build artificial agents which have additional timescales which we don't have. The current agents are very mono-timescale, very boring. They have just one or two timescales, and that's probably one key feature. So here you see there's a certain overlap, a certain similarity in timescales between environment, and with the much larger range of timescales. So for me, everything is about timescales. We had a paper in 2021 where we discussed that. So here you see, and that's of course the temporal ontology. It's clear. And I think that leads you to a Copernican revolution. And I must say, whatever you say, whether I'm wrong with the space-time, with this Copernican thing, you can say it's all bullshit, not of go home, but at least it leads to very interesting experimental ideas. I'll show you some of them tomorrow. Yeah, some crazy ideas which are really interesting, and also to interesting linkage from the seemingly unpublished paper where we link these timescales directly to Heidegger, and that we say, look, Heidegger, your ontology is not as fundamental as you think. It's still anthropocentric, and it is, yeah, because it's still a being in the world. It's very anthropocentric what he does. Yeah, it's not thought completely from the perspective of the world, Heideggerian turn, and then he turns to confuse semiotics and semantics, if you want to criticize. Yeah. So he was aware of the problem, but he couldn't go further with the tools of the problem. That's where you need to bring in the empirical. Yeah. The bird singing last time, of course, it's a beautiful example. Space, subjective space. Yeah. We have, when I know I've neglected the space dimension because it's so difficult to research empirically, yeah, subjective space, it's your extension of space, yeah, the way you behave. I often observe in my patients, they come completely anxious, they're subjective space, I'm not talking about objects, they're like this, yeah. So and if I approach them, they're very afraid, so I need to also stay like this, and gradually, during the sessions, I come to a little bit closer. Subjective space, that's what your brain constructs, yeah? Of course, this beautiful example because it's nothing special. Yeah, it's just ecological relevance, and you pointed it out. Yeah, concept of time. I make it very short. I mean, it's clear I'm not for a block view of time. I'm probably more if you want to go for presentism. If you do the two main metaphysical streams of time, but I'm not sure. I haven't studied them enough. But what I studied, I feel a certain uncomfortable with this distinction. So probably I would undermine them, but yeah.
Muchas gracias, profesor. Gracias. No sé si Valentina o Raúl, antes de darle la palabra al profesor Salinas, ¿quieren conversar algo o le doy la palabra al profesor Salinas? Ya, después podemos hacer una ronda final de cierre, si les parece. Profesor Salinas, buenas tardes, bienvenido.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias. Guten Tag, Professor Nordhoff, und vielen Dank. Y hasta ahí mi alemán, no sé todo lo que sé. Muchas gracias. Tal como acá se presentó, soy neurólogo de un servicio clínico y un servicio de urgencia. Y por lo mismo me excuso de antemano por lo pedestre de mi intervención y cuestionamiento al planteamiento del profesor Nordhoff, pero que tiene relación finalmente con el último acto quizá que existe entre el individuo en tanto tal y la sociedad, como es el diagnóstico de muerte, que finalmente ha ido siendo medicalizado por la sociedad y ha ido cambiando su criterio y planteando desde la neuroética una mirada completamente diferente en los últimos años a lo que fue tradicionalmente durante la existencia, ¿no es cierto?, del individuo humano, los últimos 120.000 años, y quién eran responsables finalmente de decir que alguien había muerto y que se podía seguir adelante con todo el ritual civil, religioso y social que implica estar frente a un cadáver. Estamos próximos a cumplir 65 años de la publicación en l'Osservatore Romano de un discurso pronunciado por el cardenal Eugenio Pacelli al término de su largo pontificado que llevó bajo el nombre de Pío XII en el cual insinúa él, por primera vez en letra de molde, algo que posteriormente fue una revolución para la medicina y particularmente para la neurología, como fue cambiar el criterio con el cual se declaraba a un individuo que pasaba de vivo a muerto, y que aquel que era una persona de la especie humana pasaba a ser un cadáver y por lo tanto de persona a cosa, como lo entiende la mayoría de las legislaciones. Señalaba el cardenal Pacelli un ejemplo que sorprende hasta hoy, al menos a mí como neurólogo, por su actualidad. Decía lo siguiente Pacelli, decía: la muerte se muestra ya después del traumatismo craneano grave que ha provocado la inconsciencia profunda y la parálisis respiratoria central, cuyas consecuencias inmediatamente mortales hayan podido, sin embargo, ser retardadas por medio de la respiración artificial. ¿O se produce la muerte, según la opinión actual de los médicos, que él cuestionaba, solamente después de la paralización definitiva de la circulación de la sangre, a pesar de la prolongada respiración artificial? Se preguntaba en el resto de ese interesante discurso Pacelli en qué momento el alma abandonaba el cuerpo, que por supuesto para un católico, como supongo era el Papa, significaba finalmente el diagnóstico de muerte. Claro, para los que no somos creyentes ese argumento no tiene gran validez, pero la pregunta persiste. ¿En qué momento ocurre la muerte? ¿Puede desde el análisis de la neuroética existir una respuesta como insinuaba el Papa y como finalmente se ha desarrollado, lo cual no significa que sea una materia saldada? ¿Y es esta acaso la demostración cultural más palmaria de la identidad que culturalmente ha sido aceptada entre el individuo y su cerebro, llevada al extremo de equiparar la pervivencia del encéfalo no solo a la identidad humana del individuo, sino que a su propia existencia como ser vivo? Y además está decirlo, a lo que decía el título de esta mesa redonda, a la extinción de toda responsabilidad moral, como ocurre con los muertos. En un señero artículo publicado por el profesor Nordhoff en el año 2004 en Filosofía Naturalis, y que él generosamente comparte en su sitio web, que lo invito a visitar porque tiene de gratuito acceso todos esos artículos que son imposibles de encontrar incluso en los sitios piratas que nuestros alumnos frecuentan. Y aparece este artículo con el provocador título ¿Soy yo mi cerebro? Am I my brain? Y se embarca el profesor Nordhoff en un análisis sobre la identidad personal y la identidad del cerebro. Y a partir de un análisis crítico que tengo que reconocer después de leer 10 veces, comprendí o creí comprender, hace un contrapunto entre Thomas Nagel, a quien citó en su artículo, y Derek Parfit, que son contradictorios entre sí frente a esa respuesta, y apoya su análisis en una investigación empírica en pacientes con enfermedad de Parkinson a quienes se les inyectó tejido fetal en el cerebro. Y finalmente esboza una respuesta a esta interrogante sobre la relación entre la identidad de la persona y su cerebro, enfatizando aquello que hizo en su exposición, en la necesidad de desarrollar una neuroepistemología y una neuroontología que nos proporcione una respuesta, y aquí viene lo atractivo para un médico, que sea empíricamente plausible, que es la expresión que utiliza el profesor Nordhoff. Entonces, finalmente, para redondear mi intervención y mi pregunta, es cierto que esta reflexión desde la epistemología y la ontología nos puede ayudar a resolver de modo convincente la relación que existe entre la identidad del individuo y el cerebro. Pero permite además, es lo que pregunto, la identificación de ese punto que fisiológica y culturalmente separa la vida de la muerte. ¿Puede esta línea de investigación neuroepistemológica y neuroontológica ayudar a respaldar o refutar ese criterio de muerte que hoy día legalmente es vigente en Chile, por ejemplo? Y siguiendo la misma línea de pensamiento, y a lo mejor estirando mucho el hilo, ¿puede desplazar este análisis, ese criterio de muerte encefálica, desde el cese total de todas las funciones del encéfalo, que es la forma hoy día prevalente de aproximarse a él, a la pérdida solo de las funciones neocorticales que permiten la propia conciencia y la relación con el medio, como ha propuesto, por ejemplo, Robert Beach, en Georgetown, en Estados Unidos. Muchas gracias, profesor Noto.
Yeah, very important issues. Let me just briefly go through, so I focus my answer on around the death. So first, an ontological view on death. There's a beautiful, I'm very much impacted over the last 10 years by Chinese philosophy, in particular Taoism, and in particular Zhangzi, which is an old Taoist philosopher, and that was his metaphors, beautiful stories. And one of the stories which every student in both mainland China and Taiwan knows is the mourning of his wife. So Zhangzi, his wife dies, and first he's very unhappy, obviously, and then suddenly he's very happy. And then his friend, the logician, I can't remember the name, the logician comes and asks him, what's going on? You cannot be happy when your wife is dying. And Zhangzi says, yeah, at the beginning I was really sad about the loss of my wife. And then later I came to see that now basically she returns to the world, to the earth, where she is coming from. So he describes the whole circle of life, and I'm happy for her that she is back and embedded in it. And that's what made him happy. That's for me the true Copernican revolution. So in a paper which is translated into Chinese and has never been published in the Western world, it's impossible. I use that as an example that they were much earlier in the Copernican revolution than us. Yeah, that's really unpublishable here in the Western world. The Canadians would lock me up. Yeah. So that, I think, it's a beautiful example. That's ontology. Context. I think in the current definitions of death, I'm not an expert in that field. The context is neglected. I know one story, I can't remember why I read it, that he was already dead, and then his wife came in, and she was long separated, then she came in, and he had another flash of life, yeah, of consciousness, yeah, context. And my own experience, so we do a lot of empirical studies in disorders of consciousness, coma patients, and I often also saw these patients by myself. Context is absolutely important. And I asked all the relatives whether they have the feeling there's sort of a certain connection. Yes. Yeah. So now, how would I define death? First, I think empirically, now it's an empirical dimension I'm touching here. I think first we need to distinguish between the loss of consciousness and then the loss of life. Yeah. And obviously they're not the same. You know that very well. So the loss of consciousness would really go for me with they're not speaking that loud. Sorry. Sorry, I'm just joking. Yeah. Sorry. So the loss of consciousness really seems to go along with the loss of input processing, of relationship to the world. We did a study where we investigated people with loss of consciousness or altered consciousness, sleep, anesthesia, and coma and vegetative state, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which you know is a motor condition. They lose all their motor functions, but still have consciousness. So, and we looked for various of our dynamic measures, which are indicated here. And indeed, all the loss of consciousness people had altered values in these. The ALS people, even we have recently a paper submitted on complete locked-in syndrome, where you don't even have the vertical eye movement. It's a horrible condition. And they still have normal dynamic. Yeah? So that really supports the view that these dynamic measures are not just making a pocket gambler tricky. Yeah? And we can really show they really serve for the presence or absence of consciousness. However, that's not your question. Your question is a different one, it's much deeper. What you see in these disorders of consciousness, anesthesia in the brain, you still see activity. You still see, but you don't see a structure in that. You don't see this, let's say, power structure like I indicated in that way. It's diffuse, it's discoordinated, it's not synchronized. Yeah? So aberrant. So I would say, using a Kantian term, the form of the neuronal activity is lost. There's no structure which we can measure with power law exponent, autocorrelation function, and various other measures from engineering. Yeah. So now, and when you lose life, then you lose any activity, meaning you don't have the propensity for activity change anymore. Boom. Change is important. We maintain our continuity of life through change. It's completely paradoxical conceptually. If you don't change, you die. Yeah? If your neuronal activity remains the same, you die. The same on the level of the self. If you don't change, we maintain our temporal continuity, because temporal continuity is defined by and measured through continuous change. It's the pattern of change. Yeah? And I think that's the key. So loss of consciousness, loss of the neuroecological alignment, temporal spatial alignment, we speak in our temporal spatial theory of consciousness, and loss of activity change for the empirical definition of loss of life. Last question, am I my brain? I had to smile a little bit. You know, every academic has her or his early sins. Yeah, this is one of them. Nowadays, I would answer that question very clear. It's you preserve your identity first through change. This is what I just mentioned. Through continuous change. It's completely paradoxical because temporal identity originally by Locke was defined basically you're frozen, you're always the same. Sameness through change. Conceptually, that's completely paradoxical. Any philosopher would probably kill me, but ontologically, that's what the data suggest. Yeah. So I think there we really need a broader conceptual framework. And of course, I would define that neuroecological or world-brain relation underlying personal identity through time and space. Yeah. One example from an empirical study, and then I shut up, is that, sorry, I need some water, that we investigated one study, fascinating. So when we touched a real hand, somebody had to touch a real body with a hand and an artificial hand. Yeah, animate versus inanimate. And it made huge difference in your subjective time and space experience. Yeah? Your time and space were much more extended and synchronized with the real hand. And the artificial, and people could not see it because like this in the scanner, yeah? They were lying in the scanner like that. So it makes a huge difference. And that's what I want to point out. This is the subjective time and space. Yeah? Animate, and that's your phenomenology. Yeah? That's key. And in the brain, it went along with certain dynamic features. Okay, sorry, this one.
Gracias, profesor. Tenemos que terminar lamentablemente. Agradezco a los profesores presentes, agradezco al profesor Northoff. Nos vemos mañana, ¿no? En medicina. Agradezco a toda la audiencia. Nos quedamos sin preguntas con el micrófono, lo lamento mucho. Nos vamos al almuerzo, ¿no? Y después volvemos para el panel de la tarde. Muchas gracias a todos y todas. Wonderful. Thank you very much.